Hello, thanks for joining me for this second installment in our series on Simone de Beauvoir's Ethics of Ambiguity. We left off last time with the notion of failure, and I wanted to just pick up there and then move into discussing this issue of a conversion, of an existential conversion that Beauvoir talks about. So remember, the failure is wrapped up in this idea that we never fully coincide with being. As a being for itself, I am always at a distance, even at a distance from myself, right? That's the decompression of being that Sartre talks about, where rather than being a fullness of being that holds a relationship of self-identity, I am spread out, I am decompressed, and there's a distance created between me and the objects of which I am conscious, including my own consciousness of myself. I have to be able to take myself as an object, and so I must be able to stand before myself in order to become that object of which I am conscious. Now, I'm also spread out in time, of course. I have the past that I have been, future that I'm not yet. So what we can't do is be something. We're not creating this distance in order to be a particular thing. Beauvoir introduces and makes a very important point here about disclosure. That is the alternative that she's suggesting. If we can't be something, if we can't have a full coincidence with ourselves, then we must disclose being. So she says, the term in order that clearly indicates an intentionality. It is not in vain that man nullifies being. So this negation or this nothingness is not in vain. Thanks to him, being is disclosed, and he desires disclosure. So things appear to us as certain things with certain significations. That object over there appears to me as a chair. It's disclosed to me in a certain way with particular meanings, significations, characteristics, aspects that I am able to pick out. And I want this disclosure. I want to have experiences inform me in a certain way and get meaning and signification out of my experiences. So I have this desire. There is an original type of attachment to being, which is not the relationship wanting to be, but rather wanting to disclose being. Now here there is not failure, but rather success. This end, which man proposes to himself by making himself a lack of being, is in effect realized by him. So we can't achieve being, we can't be coincidental with something, but we can disclose being, and we can do that quite successfully. Think again back to the other ambiguity that she discussed in Pyrrhus and Cineas, where every end is a beginning. So even when I get to the end of a certain project, there's still not that full coincidence there because is opening up. So this is going to lead her to discuss the conversion just on the immediately following pages. So we have to assume this failure, we have to take it up, and we have to realize it as an important part of how we are. We don't want to deny the failure or try to hide it, we want to own it. The failure is not surpassed, but assumed. Existence asserts itself as an absolute which must seek its justification within itself, not suppress itself, even though it may be lost by preserving itself. To attain this truth, man must not attempt to dispel the ambiguity of his being, but, on the contrary, accept the task of realizing it. So, this task of realizing it is why Beauvoir introduces the existential conversion. The conversion is going to help us get the right sort of attitude and perspective on it. It's going to be a sort of theoretical move that puts us in a position to better think about and analyze our projects and so on. Now, she recognizes that the Stoics have a similar sort of conversion, but she wants to make a distinction. In the Stoic conversion, which she also discussed in Pyrrhus and Cineas, right? The Stoic assumes a sort of formal freedom from which they distance themselves from their experiences, but it's just so the experience can pass through them, and they can remain like a passive observer that just kind of acknowledges the experience but doesn't engage in it. This is, of course, no good for existentialism because you can't help but be engaged. That this is in the section of Pyrrhus and Cineas about the instant and the withdrawal into the self. Just like we can have a false objectivity, which she'll talk a lot about in the Ethics of Ambiguity, the idea that we falsely attribute objectivity to values that we see in the world rather than realize that we found them. We can also have a false subjectivity, and this is where we separate the project from the end, and we can then reduce it to like a diversion or a game, right? So this is what happens with the Stoic, who opposes a sensible universe to a formal freedom, basically. They can remove themselves from the sensible universe, merely observe it, and be a passive observer, and allow experiences to go by. Beauvoir thinks existential conversion is closer to Husserl's phenomenological reduction. So she wants to distance herself from the Stoic conversion. That can't be right. What the existential conversion is doing is much more like Husserl's phenomenological reduction. So in the epoche, the phenomenological reduction, according to Husserl, I have a natural attitude whereby I assert the real existence of the objects of my perception independently of me. So I see a glass on the table, and I operate under the thesis that that's a real object that exists in the world independently of my perception, and so on and so forth. The epoche wants to put those theoretical questions in brackets. So it is a modification of the natural attitude that transforms the natural attitude into the phenomenological one, where I'm not worried about the ontological status of the existence of the objects I see. I'm just worried about the way in which they appear to me. I reduce the scope of my philosophical investigation to appearances. This is a similar move that Beauvoir is going to make with the existential conversion. So she says about that, let man put his will to be in parentheses, and he will thereby be brought to the consciousness of his true condition. And just as phenomenological reduction prevents the errors of dogmatism by suspending all affirmation concerning the mode of reality of the external world, whose flesh and bone presence the reduction does not, however, contest, so existentialist conversion does not suppress my instincts, desires, plans, and passions. It merely prevents any possibility of failure by refusing to set up, as absolutes, the ends toward which my transcendence thrusts itself, and by considering them in their connection with the freedom which projects them. So the existential conversion does not posit my values and ends as being absolute, that I'm really working towards some deep, truthful, objective fact of the world that's like ingrained into the very fabric of reality. No, those ends are always related back to the freedom that projects them, to my decision to engage with them, follow them, so on and so forth, right? That is the key of the existential conversion, right? It prevents any possibility of failure by refusing to set up absolutes, the ends towards which my transcendence thrusts itself, right? So that's how we're going to get the success of disclosing the world in a certain way. Now, there's a couple of implications that follow. And also you can begin to see the language of authenticity. She calls it genuine. The genuine man will not agree to recognize any foreign absolute. So there is no absolute independently of human existence, and in fact, that is not immanent to human existence. Any value that we find, whether it's absolute or anything like that, must be immanent to human projects and plans and engagements. So she then goes on, renouncing the thought of seeking the guarantee for his existence outside of himself, he will also refuse to believe in unconditioned values which would set themselves up athwart his freedom like things. Value is this lacking of being of which freedom makes itself. and it is because the latter makes itself a lack that values appear. So again, value comes entirely from the human condition and human projects. Values aren't independent things that are in the world apart from the human projects that generate them. And values are generated exactly through the distance of my desire for an object. By moving toward an object in my transcendence, a value arises that I must value it somehow. The very movement of my existence toward or away from the object signals some kind of value is arising, that I desire it, that I want to be free of it or get rid of it, or that I'm afraid of it, or that whatever the case may be, right? So values are bound up with human projects. It is human existence which makes values spring up in the world, on the basis of which it will be able to judge the enterprise in which it will be engaged. That's so pretty clear. That value is in the domain of human existence and not outside of it. Then, of course, she addresses some of the key criticisms of existentialism, right? If man is free to define himself the conditions of a life which is valid in his own eyes, can he not choose whatever he likes and act however he likes? Dostoevsky asserted, if God does not exist, everything is permitted. And this is a standard, people worry, well, without God, how do you have ethics? Can there be any morality without God, and so on and so forth. Clearly, Beauvoir thinks yes. She's writing a book on ethics. She's an atheist. So she's going to respond to this very typical sort of, especially Christian response. I think this is a standard Christian response. She has it the other way. Far from God's absence authorizing all license, the contrary is the case. Because man is abandoned on the earth, because his acts are definitive, absolute engagements, he bears the responsibility for a world which is not the work of a strange power, but of himself, where his defeats are inscribed in his victories as well. A God can pardon, efface, and compensate, but if God does not exist, man's faults are inexpiable. God can't save us, according to Beauvoir. Without God, our decisions are absolute. There's nothing that can excuse them or save them. We bear sort of full responsibility for our decisions. There's nothing that we can shrug our responsibility off onto. No way we can disburden ourselves from the commitments we've made or choices that we've made and all of that kind of stuff. Nothing will alleviate us of the responsibility of our actions. And so humanity becomes radically responsible, right? It is up to man to make it important to be a man, and he alone can feel the success or failure, and so on. So again, we've rejected all of those outside sort of problems, right? And yet, still, you have, I think, a criticism that strikes closer to the heart that she deals with next. Even among the proponents of secular ethics, there are many who charge existentialism with offering no objective content. It is said that the philosophy is subjective and even solipsistic. I mean, here is where she gets into the stuff about, look, our existence as subjectivities and the values that we generate are objective facts of the world. It's not as if there are two worlds and we live in one world and in the other, and we create values in the subjective world and they have no role in the objective. No, our existence in the world as a for itself and as a subjectivity is an objective fact of the world. That our being is ambiguous. It's not a duality. It's not Cartesian substance dualism where we have two types of being that we are. No, we are being for itself, and this creates a kind of ambiguity in our existence. And the way that the world appears to us is a fact of the world, because here we are. And so that's where she says, affirming the source of all value resides in the freedom of man. Existentialism merely carries on the tradition of Kant, Fichte, and Hegel, who, in the words of Hegel himself, have taken for their point of departure the principle according to which the essence of right and duty and the essence of the thinking and willing subject are absolutely identical. The idea that defines all humanism is that the world is not a given world formed to man, one to which he has to force himself to yield from without. It is the world willed by man, insofar as his will expresses his genuine reality. Now, still, someone might still have a problem. All well and good, but Kant escapes solipsism because for him, genuine reality is the human person insofar as it transcends its empirical embodiment and chooses to be universal, right? But for existentialism, she says, it is not impersonal universal man who is the source of values, but the plurality of concrete particular men projecting themselves toward their ends on the basis of situations whose particularity is as radical and as irreducible as subjectivity itself. So part of the problem, again, that people have tried to combine humanity into one sort of mass humanity, capital H, everybody all together. But Beauvoir thinks that values arise in the world because there is actually separation between individuals, and these individuals exist together in humanity only through their connection and concerted action together. It's not that they blend all together in an abstract humanity where everybody is totally theoretically equal. No, humanity arises out of the very concert of all of our projects together as for itself, which depends upon our fundamental separation, not just from each other, but from the world so that it can appear to us and other people. I mean, think back to this passage where she says, by uprooting himself from the world, there's the separation and the distance, by uprooting himself from the world, man makes himself present to the world and makes the world present to him. I should like to be the landscape which I am contemplating. I should like this sky, this quiet water, to think themselves within me, that it might be I whom they express in flesh and bone, and I remain at a distance. But it is also by this distance that the sky and the water exist before me. My contemplation is an excruciation only because it is also a joy. I cannot appropriate the snowfield where I slide. It remains foreign, forbidden, but I take delight in this very effort toward an impossible possession, right? So it's important and necessary that we be separate. There is an ethic only if there is a problem to solve, and it can be said, by inverting the preceding line of argument, that the ethics which have given solutions by effacing the fact of the separation of men are not valid precisely because there is this separation. So they remain purely theoretical because they don't grapple with the fact of humanity's separation and individualization. An ethics of ambiguity will be one which will refuse to deny a priori that separate existence can at the same time be bound to each other and that their individual freedoms can forge laws valid for all. So the ethics of ambiguity is going to try to work with that. It's going to try to show that these separate existence, human beings in their individual lives, can be bound together, and that their individual freedoms can forge laws valued for all. Because each person is free in their individual. It's not an abstract consideration. They have their situation in which their freedom is enacted. But freedom is the basis of all of our projects. And so freedom is going to start to play the role of an absolute value in existentialism, but it's one that is an immanent absolute. It's immanent to human projects. And one of the reasons why it gains universal validity is because every project universally requires freedom in order to be actualized. It's not outside the sphere of human existence. So we'll stop there, and then we'll do the next video on this section where she tackles some issues in Marxism. I think the key here is we don't want to possess or be something. We want to disclose the world in certain ways. So this is something we can succeed at, and the success is predicated upon the initial failure of self-coincidence and coincidence with the world. So because we don't coincide and we fail to possess being, we instead disclose being as the certain kind of being that it is. And it has certain values. And those values arise exactly from our disclosure of the being through the active engagement that we take on it that defines values in relation to our ends, projects, and engagements. What is it useful for? Well, what are you trying to do? And that is going to determine the use value of the thing, whether or not it's a help or a hindrance to achieve this particular project. The value, the shape of your love depends upon the object that your love is directed toward, and so on and so forth. How you feel about it, how you're conflicted or not conflicted, or whether you're jealous or that kind of thing. This is going to be shaped by your engagement and orientation toward the object that is the one that you love. So the existential conversion then wants us to sort of set aside and forget about projecting those values into an absolute independent of human existence. We will reject that line. We will say there is no external justification for my choices and commitments, and we will remain committed to a totally human value. Now that means, though, that the value then is also relative to the ends, right? Nothing is going to justify a particular end for me. It is my job to justify that for myself and before the others. And that's something that we'll talk much more about. So I'll come back in the next video and I will talk in more detail about that Marx section that's coming up. I hope you found this helpful to clarify the idea of an existential conversion. And we'll continue to work our way through the Ethics of Ambiguity. Thanks.